everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. Before I get into anything, I want to issue an apology. No, really, I am actually really sorry. I kind of just forgot to record an episode last week. And it's the first time in 8 months since I've started this podcast that I've sort of skipped a week. And a bit of good news with it is that the reason that I didn't record anything last week is because I was recording something else. And that is the video essay that I've been working on for the last 2 months and is very close to being released, I think. I did 2 whole drafts of it. I filmed myself, edited it, did all the stuff, then refilmed myself. And I don't know, I'm actually really happy with how it's all come together. I've had to do a lot of learning. I've had to do a lot of self-study of I've been learning audio stuff for the last 8 months, but video editing is a whole different thing. And yeah, so I'm hoping that that'll be out within this next week, so stay tuned. It's the video essay which I talked about 2-3 episodes ago, Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. And yeah, I think for my first video essay, I'm kind of proud of myself. And I really look forward to hearing what all of you will think of it. But yes, that has taken up the bulk of my time, which is kind of also a good thing. Having a project is so helpful and was so essential for me the last few weeks, just having something to really sink my teeth into. It was the first time in a very long time that I was excited about something, and I think that shows. So yeah, that's what I've been doing the last 2 weeks. But for today's episode, I do want to talk about 2 things. One is the fact that I've noticed something that I knew was going to happen and I was worried was going to happen, which is the tankies have figured out that Sudan exists. I don't know why, but they've been writing and giving their takes, and it's been just as shitty, but for a totally different group of people now. I'd noticed for the last few years that tankies, these online so-called leftists, have kind of ignored Sudan and the Sudanese revolution, and in the last year, this war, or last year and a half. And I talked about this in the interview that I had with Sarah al-Hassan, which is that there doesn't seem to be, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, or the opposite. As in, yes, there's less attention, but also with that means that there aren't these unbelievably ridiculous takes by these completely irrelevant people who have huge followings online. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've been seeing in relation to what they've been posting, how the Sudanese online commentators have been responding and reacting to these takes in very similar fashion to how Syrians and just so many other groups of people around the world have been responding to this essential erasure by these white supremacist lefties. The second thing is something that I kind of just want to explore because, I don't know, I feel like it's a concept that definitely exists. I imagine it exists. I did some brief Googling of it, and it seems like most use of it is kind of ranging from the benign to the kind of reactionary. But that is self-marginalization. And I have one specific case that I'm going to talk about, and I'll bring that up when I do. But before I start anything else, and I feel a bit silly doing this, especially after being gone for the last 2 weeks, but this podcast is supported by listeners like you. And if you want to support this podcast, you can do so in multiple ways. And one way that I recommend is either joining our Patreon or becoming a member of our Apple Podcast subscriber if you're listening to the podcast through Apple Podcast. The reason that I say I recommend it is because we're now moving towards creating more exclusive content. We as in from the periphery. And just last week we recorded our first kind of recorded roundtable where it's just a bunch of us from the collective sitting around talking about something for an hour, 2 hours. It's an idea that I've tried to get off the ground for a while because it's so easy. We are just a group of really interesting, unique people. I love them. I'm really happy to be part of this collective. And so, yeah, that's going to be available for Patreon members and for Apple Podcast subscribers. We're planning on doing it either once a week or once a month. But either way, that on top of Keep This Between Us and, supporting all the other podcasts in the process, I'd really appreciate anybody who is able to head over to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. Or, again, if you're on Apple Podcast, I think you can see if you look at the app, it says that this podcast is part of a channel. Click on that channel, and then you can become a member. And yeah, that's the announcement for this week. So, the tankies have discovered Sudan. And my heart goes out to all the Sudanese, to all the people online, to all the people who care about Sudan, and who now have to deal with this added bullshit, with this added distraction. For those that don't know, I did a whole episode on tankies, I think 2 or 3 episodes ago, but just for concision's sake, I will be running with the definition of people who cosplay as leftists online and unknowingly replicate white supremacist erasure. And I think that's a pretty good definition. It works for Twitter and for just like online discourse stuff because it's so frustrating and the patterns are so clear. So I saw a tweet a couple of days ago by a pretty big account, that's been posting about Palestine for the last 10 months, has a kind of like red triangle in their bio or in their name. And I don't know, they wrote something about how it's AFRICOM that's like meddling in Sudan. And a lot of Sudanese jumped on this and were like, no, girl, like, I don't know. Although there is obviously a lot of discussion about US and EU funding and support, specifically of the RSF, but also of Al-Burhan and whatever, but specifically in this case of the genocidal militia that is the Rapid Support Forces. No one has talked about AFRICOM. Like, this is one of those things that there's a weird split between what Sudanese are talking about, like the large, obviously it's not like one line, like there's a pretty large and vibrant discussion and discourses that happen online. But then they come with their own narratives, these tankies. And they kind of then, I think one Sudanese person called this person out, and so their reaction was to say, oh, you're defending American imperialism. And that's the exact same thing that they say to Syrians, the exact same things that they say to the Lebanese, to just anybody who does not fit, inconveniently enough, within their own narratives of this binary of the world, where there's this US empire, and then everyone else who is the subaltern and who is resisting, and there's just, you either fit in one or the other. The world just does not work like that. A big problem with the tankies is that it's a fantasy. And with that fantasy comes erasure of people. And the people who are there claiming to be speaking on behalf of and for and whatever. And there's just this like steamroll effect where they write these things that gain traction and, completely erases and ignores and neglects what Sudanese are saying. And so in this case, I think I'm really worried. I'm really hoping that it's not going to accelerate, like there's not going to be more of this discourse. I think it might be happening because there's now these peace talks. Well, supposed peace talks, they're bullshit. But with that comes a stronger, more explicit US hand in Sudan. And so basically, the very basic calibration of some of these tankies is to see the US doing something and then, oh, we must be with the opposite. And, that's kind of a good knee-jerk reaction, but not a way of understanding complex, things that have their own histories, that indeed have their own people who are talking about these things and who are sharing their analysis. But yeah, I kind of went off on one there. I do worry about this, that sometimes when I do these podcast episodes that I kind of just get lost in what I'm saying. I still hope it's coherent. But yeah, it's kind of frustrating. These people who clearly know nothing about Sudan, clearly have never encountered a Sudanese person, clearly are not, listening and engaging with Sudanese voices and their struggles, and just come in with their takes and, you know, and then get into fights, pick fights with Sudanese people who are saying, who are criticizing them. I don't know. These people are grifters, they're cosplayers. And again, I'm just very sorry that Sudanese people have to deal with this now on top of everything that they're dealing with. And yeah, it just reminds me so much of Syria, of Lebanon, of just so many cases wherein we're dealing with so much real bullshit, and then we go online and dealing with a whole new sort of bullshit in the place of what could be interesting, constructive, practical, tangible conversations that could potentially lead to actual something, internationalism. I've been talking about internationalism a lot these days, but I really think that's something that needs to be much more discussed and realized, because I really don't see, coming from Lebanon, fuck, we need this. Palestine, all these things, our entire region, the entire global south, we need internationalism. And I don't know. And honestly, in many ways, tankies are opposed to internationalism. I don't think they can understand it. I think they can only understand states. I don't know, it's a very basic thing. I don't like discussing this sometimes because I find myself dealing with an ideology that's really just not very thought out. There's no analysis. There's nothing there. It just is this very basic chessboard, and here are the moving parts. And I don't know, the way they talk about these things, it just reduces Sudan, reduces Africa to a place for resources. I don't know, there's something very colonial in the mindset, and the only way they can understand or imagine is to use the same violence. I don't know, whatever. I can't stand it. It's so frustrating. And again, it all feels like a distraction. Not just from the things that we could be talking about, but it's a new thing that people have to then be addressing. Not just dealing with actual imperialists and actual capitalists, whatever, and dealing with these, violent entities around us everywhere. But then we have to deal with this sort of erasure online, with these discourses. And also, another distraction, why I think it's important to talk about tankies is, I think there's a feeling that there's a lot going on, that there's movements, that there's a lot of popularity around certain ideas, but it's really not, I don't know, and it's not grounded in anything serious. Here, if you look at these accounts, and you see them post something, and you see the traction that it gets, and how many likes and how many whatever, there's a feeling of, oh wow, leftism is strong, and especially when they use this rhetoric or whatever. But these are oftentimes just posters. Oftentimes they're not even faced, you don't even know what they look like. And I often wonder, it's wasted time wondering, because I'm pretty sure most of them don't do shit for their own communities. Most of them aren't actually engaged, and posting is their political engagement, or what they feel like is their whatever. And I'm not saying it's completely useless to talk online, to discuss, to contribute to the discourse, but I definitely think that's not something that's the only thing. And there's definitely a rabbit hole, psychically, that, it's damaging. And I think a lot of these tankies really develop online and through space like Twitter that mediates their thought even, and what they think is possible and what they think is a right way to engage with other communities and whatever. Anyway, I've talked much more about that than I wanted to. I want to talk about this idea of self-flagellation, of self-marginalization, because again, I don't know if this is a term that has other connotations. And here, I imagine it's used in a certain way where it's black people aren't oppressed, they oppress themselves because they say they're oppressed. And that's ridiculous. Like, I think Kanye West said something similar, and, it's like mind over matter, but in terms of structural racism. No, that's not what I'm talking about at all. The example that's making me think of this term is I recently saw a deleted tweet that someone screen capped of ContraPoints. ContraPoints is this online YouTuber, video essayist, who made really incredible video essays on fascism, on democracy, on trans rights. She herself is trans. And yeah, I don't know. I've definitely mentioned a while ago how disappointed I am in her, and the cowardice, I think, that she has yet to say anything substantial about what's happening. I don't know. I'm not going to get into it. Only to say that she has a platform. She has some ability to do stuff, to say something. People listen to her, especially at a time when black and brown queer folk are so vocal. Like, this is our thing. This is what we think about every day. Stopping this genocide. She's silent. And so many people like her are silent. And not just saying that we're whatever, but like getting brutalized on the fucking streets. Anyway, she apparently wrote a tweet that said, people need to stop sending me gore from Gaza, because that's not going to make it easier for me as a YouTuber to stop the genocide. And I think she said something sarcastic then of like, I talked to BB in October, but he still went ahead anyway. So I hate this for so many reasons. And again, I found it very odd that she used the word genocide. She's aware that it's a genocide, and yet she's speaking of it in such a candid manner, and also describing the things that we're all seeing, these brutal examples of Israeli injustice and violence and barbarity as gore, as though it's something on Live Leak. The mutilated bodies that are destroyed by the Israeli bombs that are funded by her tax dollars as an American citizen. She calls it gore. And then it's this thing of her saying, I'm just a YouTuber. I find that very strange, because her being a YouTube video essayist has never stopped her from talking about incredibly important issues, like fascism. In a lot of ways, she started, for years, was talking about fascism, was talking about incredibly deep and intense subjects. And so why now, in this case, does she claim that she has no ability? I mean, if she literally were to post just a link to Gaza eSIMs, or to any of the mutual aid funds, or any GoFundMe, she could raise thousands of dollars. She could raise millions. If she, just posted it instantly. If she actually committed herself a bit, and this could save lives. This could do so much. If she literally tweeted about pinkwashing, or did an essay, or did a video about, just like, she has a large following. And there are a lot of people that would listen to her. And that would, I don't know. What I find deeply frustrating, and I've definitely talked about this so much in this podcast, is that it is precisely those that are most actually marginalized who are trying as hard as possible to do what they can, who do feel the sense of duty, who are kind of empowered, who are already marginalized, and so don't self-marginalize on top of that. And again, some of it is out of necessity. And that's not to say that marginalized people can't perform self-marginalization. I think that's a whole other conversation, though. Here I'm talking about someone who actually does have certain access to influence, in a small way, to power. And in this one instance, is claiming, no, I am just a YouTuber. I can't talk about something like this colonial genocidal violence that we're witnessing every day. And at the same time, those who have much less access to influence, much less access to power, are the ones on the streets. That dichotomy always fractures my mind. And here I branch out away from ContraPoints and think about all the other people who I know who are able but choose not to. I once kind of was playing with this idea in my mind of trauma as being one of a lack of choice. As in, trauma inhibits your ability to express certain aspects or certain actions of your being, of whatever. You don't really choose to get traumatized, and once you are traumatized, once you experience trauma, your windows of options are just less, you know? You have less ability to move. There are, I don't know, the walls around you kind of close in. And this is true not only of like domestic violence and just like straight up abuse, but I think this has economic, political, and social factors or like implications as well. Because here, I mean, the trauma of fucking poverty. This is why I find it very ridiculous when, kind of tech boys or crypto, whatever, and I don't know, like, motivate yourself out of poverty. It's fucking ridiculous. And it reveals the kind of lack of understanding of what it actually feels like to experience poverty. And the kind of how it makes the walls around you shrink. And this is true with people with disabilities. And again, there are very material things about this. Like, this isn't just up in the air about, like, what do I feel like doing or whatever. But so, I don't know, I do see, as a general rule, that white people self-marginalize. I don't know, there's always this appeal to, I don't know, I'm just one man. There's a joke, obviously. There's 1,000 jokes. I think there's a Simpsons joke with, like, Homer saying, what can I do? I'm just, and he, like, counts with his fingers, one man. Or there's a great joke, actually, from The Simpsons, where he says, the complete opposite joke, he says to his wife, he says, oh, I'm a white male between the ages of 18 to 35. Everybody listens to me. And it's like, whatever. Anyway. So, yeah. I really don't have much to say about that point. It's just sort of an observation that some of the people who are... I've talked about this and I got a weird response on YouTube. For some reason, my video... For some reason, like not the last episode, but the one before, went kind of big on YouTube. I usually get like 20 views. This one got 2,000. I have no idea why. But so I got some comments that, I don't know, from a new audience that I think aren't aware of what this show is like. And I don't know. There's kind of this constant appeal of, I can't do anything about it. And again, I find that so bizarre coming from some people who can do something about it, for whom it is a choice. And again, the moment that they'll realize that they have to do something about it, they will have fewer choices. This is why I constantly talk about Organize Now. Or who is this climate scientist, activist, Peter Kalmus, I think, who said, we need change by design, not change by necessity. Because once it becomes a necessity, it's fucked. And you're just not able to move, not able to organize or to think even. Honestly, I kind of have forgotten. I'm really, really missing Beirut these days. And like I said, I was meant to go a few weeks ago and I canceled my trip because fucking war and the fucking occupation and the fucking Zionists, like... Anyway. But I have forgotten what it was like when I was living there and the last period I was there. And how mentally I just couldn't think. I had so much going on. There was so much happening around me. I was so exaggerating and catastrophizing, and I just never really had a second to take a step back. And it took me many, many, many months of being out of Beirut for that feeling to return, replaced by other things. But yes, I definitely think that there is something very strange with people self-marginalizing who are maybe marginalized and maybe not, but in certain circumstances really make themselves out to be much more disempowered than they actually are. And here again, I'm talking about white people. Here I'm talking about people with access to some wealth, access to class, access to whatever. I don't know. I remember once having this really interesting discussion with this person in France who told me that in order to raise funds for a squat that they were a part of, what they did is they bought suits, or like borrowed suits from some friends, went to a gala, like a fundraiser, and kind of just made up some stories and like talked to some rich donors. A lot of these rich donors kind of, it's just a tax thing. And so they lied. They said, we do this. We're a cultural center that promotes, good behavior and blah, blah, blah. And they left that night with like 2 checks for like 50,000 euros. And I found that fascinating as like such a brilliant example of using white privilege, because just putting on a suit, cleaning yourself up, whatever, you can perform white middle class, and access to the language and the common parlance and whatever. And yeah, I found that fascinating. And just one of those things where, I don't know, I want to see, that's like Robin Hood shit, That's like a really specific example, but that's just one of those few things where I'm like, damn, these are people actually doing the thing, Not just posting online, but doing a kind of direct action. I don't know, whatever. This is just another rant from me, upset that more people aren't doing more. And seeing the gap in what needs to be done and what is presently in front of me. Again, so much of my life is just dictated by the fact that, I don't know, I live in a city that is just static, that is just outside of history. I really think Europeans, and specifically white Europeans, feel and exist and perceive themselves outside of history in a kind of post-racial, post-national existence where they've kind of won, like they won the game of Risk, and this is just the post-game. And there's no real struggle now. It's just, yeah. I don't know. Apologies for this rambling episode after my 2-week absence. But, I mean, this is how I talk, so I guess if you are listening, you're probably used to it by now. So yeah, I think I'll wrap it up there. This has been another episode of Politically Depressed. And if you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting it by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/fromtheperiphery, or become a member of our Apple Podcast subscription. Send me a tip in the tip jar below, leave a rating, a review, wherever you're listening to this podcast, or just tell your friends and family about this podcast. And so, yeah, I'll see you all next time.